So welcome everybody. Welcome to Café Historique. Welcome to the revivification of Café Historique after I think a year and a half, maybe almost 2 full years of no cafe. So welcome back to Café Historique, everybody. Um, some of you who are really long-time Café Historique attendees may recognize me. My name is John Lutz. I teach history at the University of Victoria, and I was the founder of Café Historique. I think we're going back 9 years now in Café Historique. So. Um, and I'm in the meantime, I facilitated the speakers for a number of years, and then my colleagues Jill Walshaw took over and did a great job, and then my colleague Peter Cook took over and did a great job, and now I'm back. Very happy to be back as the facilitator for Café Historique. Oh, thank you. I've because those of you again who started with us 9 or 8 or 9, I can't quite remember. It's almost 10 years ago. Will remember that we got started because I was teaching a course called 10 Days That Shook the World, and there was a number of people coming asking if they could audit the class because they wanted to participate, and there was no capacity in the class, and so we thought, well, why don't we just open it up downtown and do that, and then we ran it with that theme, 10 Days That Shook the World, for a number of years, and then my colleagues took it with different themes, and but because I'm an historian, I guess, because I'm stuck in my old ways, whatever, I'm returning to the 10 Days That Shook the World theme for the next, this season anyway. So the rest of, we'll have an event in December, and I'll say more about that at the end, and then we'll have a season in the spring, and then we'll look forward to the following year as well. So I want to start by, first of all, acknowledging that we're meeting on the traditional territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt people. And, you know, I used to be uncomfortable doing territorial acknowledgements because I feel that if you just say those words, it doesn't really change the fact that we're living on somebody else's territory, or it doesn't advance the cause of reconciliation very much. And I always felt a bit uncomfortable about that. And, but over the years, I guess I felt like one of the things that I can do is try and kind of bring the two communities, Indigenous and settler communities, together. And so, you know, so our history department has kind of taken that on. And one of the ways we do that is we run organized tours of traditional territory tours run by Songhees elders who take, mostly this is focused on the university, take university faculty and students around the territory. We've organized a conference with the Songhees which acknowledges the fact that we're actually on treaty territory here. We have signed treaties with the Songhees and Esquimalt Nation, and we have obligations to them. And so having done these kind of acts, small acts, I guess I call them small acts of reconciliation, I feel like when I say a territorial acknowledgement, it's not just an empty word, that there is some act behind it to kind of help and change the world a little bit. Thank you. So I also want to say a few thank yous today. So I mentioned, I think most of you heard my announcement that the staff is short-staffed today, and they've done great service given the conditions that they're working under. I'm looking around, and almost everybody has food on their table, and the rest of you, I promise, it will come. So yeah, Shanna is in the back there at the till. I think Ashley's back there as well. The other Ashley, who is the kind of booked us in here, has just she's left the room, I think. Oh, she's here. Okay, Ashley's still here. Thanks, Ashley. At the door, we have Dave and a couple of volunteers. Joan and Ann have been kind of guiding you in through the door. They're absolute volunteers. Please give them all a big round of applause. And yeah, if you feel like the staff have done good work for you, remember them at the end of the evening when you're paying your bills. That would be great. And speaking about paying bills, I guess this is a good time to mention that how many of you come to Café Scientifique? Put your hands up here. So a third of you maybe, a quarter? Not quite, fifth? Anyway, are you asked for donations when you come to Café Historique? No, you're not asked for donations. And do you know why that is? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because our colleagues in the sciences are very well funded. They have lots of grant money. They've got lots of resource money. Us in the humanities, not quite so much. Now, I also want to say, though, that Herman's, we've been here, I think, 9 or, as I say, 8 years. Herman's charges us a small amount, $200 for every booking. That has not changed in 9 years. And in those 9 years, this place has transformed dramatically. We have the lights have changed, the sound system has changed. We have a speaker. Actually, I haven't thanked Tom, who's in the back. He's in the sound booth back there. He's there all. This is brand new. He wasn't there before when I was here last time. We're live streaming, so hello to those people who are live streaming too. This is all provided courtesy of Herman's, and all for that same low price of $200. But our department, I guess we will pay that if we have to, but we'd rather not kind of go back to my department and say, can you pay for that? So you'll notice that tonight there'll be a little gift bag passing around from table to table. And if you feel like you can throw in $3, $4, $5, if we can raise $200 tonight, that means that we break even, and it doesn't cost the department anything. We just donate our time, and we're happy to do that. So that's one announcement I'd like to make. And then I guess now it's time to introduce my speaker. It's a great pleasure to say a few words about Mitch Hammond. Mitch is a colleague in the history department at the University of Victoria who, one of the great things and one of the surprising things is when you have to introduce a colleague, you actually find out things about them that you never knew, even though you worked with them for like 20 years. I don't know, we've been working together for a long time. So this is the thing I didn't know about him. He not only has a BA, but he has a master's in religious arts from the University of Yale, from Yale University, before he went on to do a master's and a PhD at the University of Virginia. Virginia, I think today, is in the midst of gubernatorial elections, if I'm not mistaken, so you're probably watching things in Virginia. He's a specialist in early modern Europe, especially early modern Germany, and while he was doing his work and his PhD work and his other work on early modern Germany, he's paid special attention to the sick and how the people in those communities in the 1400s, 1300s, 1400s, 1500s treated people who were sick. And of course, one of the ways that they treated them was they started to religious groups and other groups started to create hospitals. And after a while, that seemed to become responsibility of civic authorities, and that kind of prompted governments to take action and started creating local civil governments. And that created the need for local civil taxation, and that created local government. And so Mitch has sort of studied that process over time, and as he studied the impact of disease on these communities, he started to be interested in disease itself and has become something of an expert in disease and epidemics. And he has a book in 2020, and do I have the title here, Epidemics in the Modern World. So this book came out in March 2020. Am I the only person who's a little bit suspicious about that timing? That it came out, coincidence maybe, do you think? Well, maybe. But coming out at that time has meant that Mitch has sold a lot of books, but also has been very much in the limelight with the local media, and not only local, but national, international media as an expert on pandemics. So I'm really excited to have Mitch here to launch the new season, the new year, the new revivification, the new post-COVID revivification of Café Historique. He's going to talk about a day that changed the world and its effects. The 24th of March, 1882? 1882. I'll let him take it from there. Please welcome Mitch Hammond.
Well, good evening. We're all here. Thank you all so much for coming out on this rather wet evening, and for those of you who are also are live streaming. And first of all, just want to sincerely thank John and also the whole staff here at Herman's for making this event possible. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to see that Herman's is not just surviving, but truly thriving and doing new things. Doing things a different way to the benefit of everyone, and I know that not just the scholars among us, but also the musicians still savor this place and its wonderful traditions and its wonderful steps forward into the future. So I've been kind of aware this year. John alluded to the fact that I had this rather spooky and entirely serendipitous coincidence with my book, and but I've been mindful that it's really hard to talk about this this topic in the sense that the challenge that I face is that historians can usually talk about something, especially when you focus on the Renaissance era, as I used to often, and you're pretty well assured that most of the people in the room haven't been thinking about your topic very much, right? You're like, oh, you know, I'm going to tell you about epidemics in the 15th century and about bubonic plague and about influenza in 1918, and people are going to be like, oh, really? Isn't that interesting? Mm-hmm. But now, of course, it's a little different, and so I just think of myself as sort of kind of thinking along with people in terms of this topic and trying to you know, put things in a slightly different frame, but very often just offering versions of ideas that have been circulating around all around us all year long. So I just am quite interested and very happy to be part of the conversation that way. So as John mentioned, a pivot point for my talk is a day in European history, the 24th of March, 1882. And that was when German doctor and researcher Robert Koch made a presentation to his colleagues in the Berlin Physiological Society about the bacteria that caused tuberculosis. It wasn't called tuberculosis very often at that time. It was called consumption. And that malady, as it was often known, was responsible for more diseases at that time than any other disease. And so Koch's lecture and demonstration soon became front-page news around the world. And it forever changed the way that many people thought about this new emergent concept of infectious disease. And so this is a part of my overall topic for this evening, which is the origins of our modern concept of a pandemic. And so what I hope to show is that our notion of infectious diseases traveling around the world, which we take more or less as self-evident in our everyday discussions of COVID-19, this idea, obvious and everyday though it is, it's also rooted in a distinctive set of contingent historical developments. So one question I'll explore is, how did our contemporary notion of pandemics take shape? I'll discuss several factors that I think were instrumental in shaping our experience of pandemics as complex events that have both biological and social dimensions. And a related concept or a question that I'll explore is, how is a pandemic public created? In the realm of public health, the public may be a group or groups of people that are responding to a pandemic crisis or expressing various opinions about it. However, the public is also one or more cohorts of people who are the focus of intervention, groups whose participation in health measures is essential to stopping the spread of disease. They are the focus of efforts, both to persuade and to some extent to control. I think there was a key period of about 3 to 4 decades of European history between around 1880 to 1920, when many ideas came into focus that remain important today. In order to cast the significance of this period, a little over a century ago, into relief, I think it's helpful to start by considering briefly where we are now. And so that's why I'm starting with this graphic here, BC's coronavirus dashboard. And I suspect you've seen something similar, if not for BC, for some other jurisdiction. Other countries and provinces have something similar. And the data represented on such dashboards itself relies on a set of meaningful assumptions, premises that enable this data to be meaningful, enable it to make sense to us. And these are assumptions that merge into the approach we have to other things in our daily life as well. And it's useful to consider how these ideas have taken shape. So obviously, with the standard limitations or qualifications apply, but a COVID dashboard assumes basically some rather self-evident things, that data are available from different places at the same time, that we can check in on how many cases of COVID-19 were identified in Mumbai today, or the island of Sri Lanka. We can just check almost anywhere we wish. COVID cases can, correspondingly, they can be counted. We can chart their rise and fall, draw pretty graphs that show where different jurisdictions are at with their experience of cases. morbidity and mortality can be charted, and now also, of course, rates of vaccination can be charted. And comparisons across regions or even continents are deemed to be pertinent. You know, we think, oh my goodness, it's really bad in Italy right now, as it was at the very beginning. Or, oh, why isn't it so bad in this part of the world? And we reflect on some of the reasons why. And of course, there's all sorts of statistical reasons and reasons to do with reporting, but we still rely on these statistics. They're hardwired into the way that we do this thing, and we do a great many other things as well. Well, people have been at this for a very long time, although not in quite the same way. Responsible officials, whether in government or the medical professions, they've counted cases of disease for centuries. So here's the disease dashboard, 1665 style, from the City of London. Very famous London bills of mortality during that city's last great epidemic of bubonic plague. But while such counting has gone on for a long time, authorities have resorted to it for different purposes. Until the later 19th century, the way people observed and counted cases of disease was influenced by a conception of disease that differs from the one that mostly prevails today. So this is a spooky rendering of cholera in the sort of mid-19th century, around the 1830s. In earlier times, so going all the way back to antiquity, on and really into the 19th century, it was believed that individual qualities, a person's individual qualities, their predispositions, and their sanitary habits influenced why some people fell ill and others did not. So for example, the course of disease was thought to vary with a person's diet, their personal habits of sleeping and waking, and their internal constitution. And chief among these characteristics was the balance among fluid humors, blood, phlegm, and bile, sort of fluid constituents of the body that people could observe on a daily basis. And these were thought to influence a person's temperament or predisposition. By the 19th century, doctrines of humors were falling out of favor, but the idea persisted that a person's innate temperament exerted influence over health. And this was often linked to conceptions of family or ethnicity, and heredity was also considered very important, although genetics did not enter the picture really until the 20th century. But these individual factors were believed to interact with environmental factors as well. Environments influenced bodies both in local settings and in different climates around the world, different sort of temperature and precipitation regimes. You know, the tropics be the obvious climate that Europeans thought of as particularly troublesome from a disease point of view. And there were lots of elaborate ways of explaining how the inner body interacted with the outer world. So this was really how many diseases, especially the ones that seemed to spread around, this was how diseases more or less were explained for a very long time in human experience. But by the 1840s, a shift was taking place, in particular in European cities, European communities, scientific and also large, now emergent industrial landscapes. And the shift was taking place to emphasize the counting of distinct cases of disease. Now, determining a cause of death along the lines of the Bill of Mortality a couple slides ago, and determining the cause of death and representing it in statistics, this was an activity that still, even at this time, left room for various kinds of individual reckoning. Accounting for disease did not have the same implication that it does today. For diseases such as cholera, counting concerned locations and environmental forces that might be conducive to the spread of disease. And here we see one of the most famous medical figures of this time, the London physician John Snow, who in the 1850s, and yeah, John with an H, by the way, those of you who watch Game of Thrones, yeah, I can still get away with that joke for like another few months, and then it's gone. Then I've got to find, a Squid Game reference. But Snow famously argued that water, rather than air, rather than miasmas and stinking clouds, argued that water was the main means by which cholera spread. And Snow famously created this map of the Broad Street neighborhood, which was struck by what in the grand scheme of things was a relatively mild outbreak, but was quite severe in this neighborhood. So it provided a kind of a close-up laboratory study for him to look at the circulation of disease. And it was his pointing to the water supply that really started to tilt things in this direction, although it didn't happen right away. His method of investigation was also an ingenious way of using old tools. People had been mapping diseases for decades by this point, using statistics, trying to reconcile different kinds of statistics with pathology. So he was not necessarily the kind of visionary kind of singular genius he is sometimes made out to be, nor did his ideas single-handedly bring this epidemic to an end. Nonetheless, it was an important step that helps to kind of symbolize and represent a couple of useful things. Snow's focus on environmental poisons was characteristic of his time, and also the discourse in the decades before him. So this was how things were in the early mid-19th century, but then thereafter, several interrelated changes fundamentally shifted how ordinary people understood and experienced widespread diseases, several things. And so the first one that I think is important is that the world got wired as never before. So we are encountering, or we are going through another wiring of the world, of course, with our ever-thickening internet. But back then, the wiring of the world was with these slender telegraph lines. Beginning in the 1850s, telegraph machines and electrical wires made communication possible across ever larger distances, and a turning point was reached, as depicted here, in 1870, when the last part of a telegraph cable linking Britain and India was laid down on the coast of England, encircling the world. And then soon after, they did it for the Pacific as well. This technology was not in place during a series of cholera pandemics that I alluded to earlier that beset Eurasia and communities elsewhere between the 1830s and the 1860s, so just before the telegraph. But thereafter, the telegraph exerted a considerable influence. Telegraph technology documented a large-scale pandemic for the first time in 1889-1890, when a disease that was called the Russian flu began a series of sweeps around the world over the next 5 years. And we're doing our best now to do away with geographic references to the origins of diseases, Ebola, Wuhan flu, and what have you, recognizing now the implications that has. But back then, that was kind of the shorthand that people often had. Did it start in Russia? We don't really know. But this so-called Russian flu swept around the world several times over the course of the next 5 years. And this is when the notion of global pandemic as we understood it could first take shape as a concept that influenced many people around the world. It could first now become a more popular concept. Now, in addition to communications technology, perceptions were also linked to the unprecedented ability of pathogens to actually spread rapidly. Transportation was changing at the same time, owing to steamships and railways. So, to some extent, the dawning awareness of a pandemic in terms of communication, this was also a reflection of what was happening actually in fact, that it was actually really possible for diseases to spread truly in a global fashion in a way that hadn't been possible before. So in this case, and others, we can't fully disentangle perceptions influenced by communications from the actual biological factors. But what I want to draw attention to here is the fact that pandemics could only be visualized when communication technology enabled people to document the simultaneous spread of disease in different locations, in geographically distant places, which is intrinsic to at least one of the key definitions of what a pandemic is. Something happening in different places all at once. Cholera, plague, and other diseases had certainly spread widely and were certainly feared, but technology had not allowed communication to confirm the independent spread of disease in several places at once. And so earlier cholera episodes, much as plague episodes had been over the centuries, they were depicted as waves that sort of swept across broad geographic areas, just as plague outbreaks in earlier times had been depicted as waves. So interaction, of course, between technology with railways enabling people and microbes to hopscotch around, communications technology, all of these things happening at once. Second, beginning in the 1860s and thereafter with increasing momentum, scientists deployed microscopes and other technical innovations to transform understandings of the microbial world. Between 1876 and 1884, research led by Robert Koch linked the activity of microbes to diseases, especially anthrax, tuberculosis, and cholera. One of the most important turning points was Koch's conclusive demonstration for the Berlin Physiological Society, as I mentioned, on the 24th of March, 1882, that a microbe caused tuberculosis. And moreover, that same microbe, a bacteria, caused other ailments, such as scrofula, which was a disorder associated with swollen lymph nodes. It caused ailments that heretofore had been considered distinct from tuberculosis. It unfolded that people said, well, it's possible for you to have spinal tuberculosis, infecting the region of your backbone. It's possible for you to have pulmonary tuberculosis in your lungs, or scrofula, the bacterium infecting your lymph nodes. And that these things were in fact one and the same thing, infection with a single bacteria instead of distinct pathologies that heretofore had been seen as distinct. After Koch staged his demonstration in Berlin and published his findings, word of his discovery shot around the world. Our communications technology, once again, in a way that had been impossible before, even for such a luminary as his older contemporary Louis Pasteur. Koch became a scientific superstar. He was mindful also of the need to provide as forceful a demonstration as he could to prove that these microbes not only existed, that they were actually there, but that they were actually causing something very important. And so he was also the first person to make photographs of bacteria that appeared in print. And one of them is depicted here, that little spindly square with the little spindles there, that's anthrax. That was one of the very first ones that was printed in 1877. People had never seen microbes before. And so over the course of about 20 years, Koch was not the only person, or indeed part of the only research community at work with this. Other people frantically jumped on board. And in the next 2 decades, germ theories went from scientific breakthrough to media sensation, and then soon after to hygiene imperative. And so as a result, here in the 19-teens and through the 1920s, Europeans and North Americans began to adopt different kinds of personal habits because they were learning about these microbes for the first time. They became ever more vigilant about personal hygiene habits, things like sneezing and spitting. But not just that. They even got suspicious of things that you might not necessarily associate with germs, unless maybe you think about it. Long skirts, sweeping dust and dirt off the floor, bushy beards, catching those nefarious microbes up, down, tucked under your mustache, gents. So we sometimes, in particular, associate short skirts with a measure of female empowerment, certainly so, but those skirts were already rising, and they were rising because ladies didn't want their hemlines to be soiled and to bring home dirt and disease to the little ones. And so before the Roaring 20s, in the era of the flappers, these hemlines were already trying to keep from collecting dangerous dirt. And of course, this coincided with other social changes as well. Growing cities developing types of mass transit that put people in close proximity to each other. Governments at various levels also began to develop forms of surveillance and control. First, revolving around visual inspections, but then, eventually, for some diseases, such as syphilis and typhoid, with blood tests. And advertisers, as you can see here, cultivated awareness of germs in order to sell products. And so consumerism then reinforced the need for individuals to safeguard their own personal health by avoiding germs. Health becomes a matter of individual responsibility in a way that had not been conceived of before. And you can notice here in the image to the right, and I'm quite interested in these kinds of images. I have a couple of them. The advertisement styled itself as performing a kind of educational service. This close-up here makes germs visible, illustrating a threat that was obscure to the naked eye. People were being educated about the fact that these germs were there. And the germs are resting here in a petri dish, an invention of its own. It had only been invented in the 1880s by an associate of Robert Koch in Berlin, a researcher named Julius Petri, who's the petri dish is named for, Mr. Petri. So if you're really fussy about it, you capitalize Petri. And then somebody bops you on the head because you're being pedantic. So this ad for Lysol from the 1920s, this is one of my favorites. It's an especially good illustration of what I call a laboratory gaze. What if your eyes were microscopes? Advertisers sought to cultivate this gaze among prospective customers. Now, we sometimes in medical history hear things about the so-called medical gaze. And the medical gaze is supposedly the gaze of the trained medical professional, often male, often gazing on people who are vulnerable, deploying various kinds of assumptions and things that ultimately result in the disempowerment of various people in elevating the medical profession. And yes, I mean this idea has substance to it as a theoretical kind of entree. The laboratory gaze was something that people came up with, and they published, and they said, "Look at this. This is what your eyes now can do." So this was an era, we have to remember, in which gazing into a microscope, this was not a routine part of education. People were not going to high school and looking at aphids and other tiny little beings in microscopes. And so these depictions, they provided consumers with a new visual vocabulary and a whole set of concepts to make concerns about infection and then therefore also action against infection, which hopefully involved buying Lysol, that made this more concrete. And of course, it also increased public awareness of laboratory sciences and the relationship that medicine had to such work. And we have to remember that until the early 20th century, doctors styled themselves as scientists, but in a very different way than we think of medical sciences today. But this kind of alliance we have with medicine, public health, technology, and so forth, it has an important point of origin in advertisements like this. Another dimension of this was home life. As depicted here, the home was depicted as a front in the war against disease. And here the sponsor was the Red Cross, but advertisers use similar images too to sell products. This image, of course, plays on the heartstrings. It's harnessing your emotions as the husband, father, labors to protect his family against an intruder. No gender signals at all here. And the family is also protected by a relatively new ally, the expert nurse, who's trained in the methods of preventing germ infection in the home. And so the fight against germs became an important responsibility for parents, homeowners, and citizens. And so this is where a lot of these obligations, this is kind of one of the important points of departure for this. And of course, today, we're debating the extent of those obligations, debating what consequences, what obligations people have for mask wearing, for social distancing, hand sanitizer, other kinds of protective measures, whether they should be legally enforced, or should they be informally expected, which one is going to be more effective, and so on. So that is a second factor, this sort of scientific shift, this paradigm shift in terms of thinking about the role of microbes. A third factor that contributed to the modern pandemic idea was a very distinctive claim that was rooted in scientific experiences, a claim to universality that was made by scientists in general and by germ theorists in particular. It was asserted that communicable disease was caused by the same constellation of forces all around the world. This was a big idea. Consider this in reference to what I was discussing a few minutes ago, where local forces, local miasmas or groundwater or soil, different kinds of ethnic predispositions, that these different communities would all have different flavors of different diseases because their locations were different, their environments were different. But here you have the conception of microbes enabled people to say, this microbe is going to behave the same way in a human body in Africa or in South America or in the Arctic, because we all have one global disease regime. And so, it was asserted, for example, that the tuberculosis germ or the influenza germ, they would all behave the same everywhere. And accordingly, it was also argued, and sometimes just merely assumed, that Western scientific methods of investigation and control were similarly valid around the world. If the microbes are the same, then our avenues and our angle of attack against them should be the same. And because Westerners, like Robert Koch, know about such things, that means we go around the world to share our knowledge. So some colonial assumptions as well harbored in this approach of science. Now, this understanding of germs had important roots in work that was performed also in colonial laboratories and on livestock diseases as well as human diseases. And this is a story that isn't told very often. But a lot of the better-known scientists that we think of, including foremost of them, Robert Koch, these folks were globetrotters. They went around the world to demonstrate that this idea that we all live in one microbial realm. And Koch, for example, made several trips to Africa in the 1890s and 1900s. Among other things, you can see him photographed here. He tried to develop a serum vaccine for rinderpest. This was a very lethal cattle disease. But when we recall that Robert Koch was photographing anthrax bacteria in 1877, he'd been working on livestock diseases for 25 years, and he'd been exploring their affinities with human diseases. So once again, linking the human world to the animal world, collapsing another barrier that had been in place in people's imaginaries for many centuries. And he also performed experiments on other diseases to test therapies for sleeping sickness. And this was a potentially lethal disease that had different varieties that affected both animals and humans. Very, very complex disease, and is spread by tsetse flies, and therefore that added to the complexity as well. And so such experiments gave scientists a unified view of a natural world in which animals and different kinds of human bodies were affected by the same kinds of microbial forces. And this here illustrates some of Koch's later work. This was in 1906, one of his later trips to Africa. He established a compound on an island in the very large lake Victoria, which is near Uganda, sort of on the border with Uganda. And here, in this rather vast lake, in these little Sese Islands, he was free of oversight, including ethical safeguards, to conduct his experiments. And so sleeping sickness research subjects, people who he was trying to treat them, but he was also trying to see what would happen when he did things. They were injected with increasing doses of atoxyl, which was a toxic arsenical compound. And this is just one example of the results. The results of this work were also used by people in Europe, notable among them Paul Ehrlich, close associate of Robert Koch, built on these colonial experiments with atoxyl to develop some of the first effective interventions with syphilis, also initially treated with an arsenical compound, arsphenamine, marketed under the name Salvarsan. That was the first effective antisyphilitic. So a colonial connection. And I like to include this picture. That's Robert Koch, our scientist. But as we know, he's an avid photographer. This is kind of his day off, I guess. And I'm interested in this photo because it's a window into how European investigators could have a tourist's mentality that coexisted alongside a strictly scientific one. So basically what we have here, if we step back from the frame, there's somebody else behind another camera to take this picture. So what we have here is a photo by a European of another European photographing some Sese Islanders who are, going about their business wondering what the fuss is about. This image was in a private collection, and the caption, probably written by Koch's wife Hedvig, can be translated as Robert Koch photographing a water collection area. To judge from the caption and from the way Coach is behaving, the individuals in the photo were considered to be more natural landscape than people. At the same time, however, at the very same time that he was taking this photograph, he was experimenting with and on people from this very same community. And findings from the experiments with the Seychelles Islanders then were applied, as I just mentioned, to populations in Europe. Such experiments gave scientists a unified view of a natural world in which animals and different kinds of human bodies were affected by the same kinds of microbial forces. So just to break down some of the claims here, because this is all new for this time. This is all being forged in ways that now appear very familiar to us. Germs, it was believed, spread similarly in humans and animals. And the presence of a pathogen, figuring out what bug was in a person, not the symptoms, what other manifestations of sickness a person had. It was the presence of a pathogen that revealed the presence of disease. Although germ behavior was consistent, though, it was still believed that populations, different groups of humans, could vary in susceptibility. Not all humans were going to get sick the same way. This was because of hygiene differences, it was believed, or because of innate physiological qualities. So some of these older ideas about distinctive human populations, ethnicities, and communities didn't go away. But this was the way that notions of racial variability could continue on, largely undisturbed by this sort of universalizing germ theory that I spoke of. Coach's work also refined the concept of what was called the carrier state, which we'll think about for a second, really important for us. This notion that somebody can carry a disease and harbor it and spread it without having any symptoms. Consider how important that notion is for us. Coach refined the concept of the carrier state during his work in Africa. Of course, we have this very much in mind today when we consider asymptomatic individuals to spread COVID infections to those who are perhaps more vulnerable. In addition, Coach's work with sleeping sickness tested the utility of population-based test and treat approaches to epidemics. And as I mentioned, he used atoxyl, a highly toxic arsenical compound. The goal of this compound was not really to heal people. It wasn't going to serve any purpose for their symptoms, but it might stop them from passing it on. And that ultimately was what Coach was interested in. How do we stop the spread of this disease rather than curing a disease? And these are distinct things, that they're separate, and Coach was interested in that. So this was work that was done, as I mentioned, without ethical safeguards. Wouldn't be done, or at least be done acceptably today. But we can still see how today, how a version of test and treat has been an initiative, albeit in different ways, during the COVID-19 crisis. Although, of course, now we've gone on past that, perhaps to some extent, the focus now in Canada is vaccines and the widening provision of vaccines to different groups. Early on, there were efforts to use testing as a population-based means of reducing the spread of COVID. Now, the information gathered from testing is imprecise, depends on all manner of sample sizes and who you're testing and who you're not, depends, of course, on the sensitivity of the tests. But many tests are done, and the results are broadcast on a daily basis by our dashboards. And it's believed that this information will help separate the sick, enable targeting of health measures, perhaps most of all, encourage the public to take action by wearing masks and practicing social distancing. So the evolving understanding of the spread of disease, which, as I mentioned, was deeply influenced by research in colonial settings, this gave rise in Europe and North America to new tools and practices that related to the surveillance of individuals and populations. As Christoph Grodman has put it, the carrier state, here to quote him, the carrier state facilitated a concept of infected individuals as a threat to society that needed to be dealt with through isolation and control. So now people, of course, have been isolated when they had symptoms, for centuries. Plague. You had the signs of plague. You got stuck in a plague house. Now it was not the signs of disease; it was the presence of the microbe. So very, very different criteria. Emphasis was also placed here, I'm just going to stick with this for just a second. Emphasis was also placed on, as I mentioned earlier, blood serum tests that proved infection. And among the first diseases to be tested with blood were typhoid in 1896, and syphilis in 1905, and eventually tuberculosis as well in 1907. So now we have a blood test, right? This is our new criteria. Do you have germs in your blood? Not do you look sick, okay? This came as a surprise, as a revelation to some people, and sometimes an unpleasant revelation. And among the people for whom it was unpleasant was Mary Mallon, who's known by the unfortunate moniker Typhoid Mary. She refused to give fluid samples. She's like, I'm not having it. I don't know what this means. This is meaningless to me. So she tried to escape with various ruses. The emerging public health authorities refused to be tested. And this illustrates, though, how a novel concept of disease transmission could be imposed upon lay people who did not yet acknowledge it or fully understand it. And eventually, it was the tests. The tests came back multiple times positive. You have, this germ in your gallbladder. You can't see it, but we can. Right? So eventually, it was determined that she was an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid, and she was involuntarily confined to an island in the East River, just in New York Harbor, near Manhattan. So that's a very vivid example of how this new public health regime was taking shape. But other kinds of tests were being done as well. Tests were administered in colonial settings, such as the Philippines, then under the control of the United States, in the Panama Canal region, where malaria and yellow fever posed a great threat to the finishing of the Panama Canal. And as tests for infection became available, concerns shifted among experts from unhealthy environments to unhealthy bodies, because that's what our tests now are showing us. It's the unhealthy bodies. And so this increasingly gained momentum with examination at sites of immigration, such as border checkpoints. Here we have Ellis Island and Angel Island, two of the more famous U.S. checkpoints. Of course, Victoria and other checkpoints in Canada too. So, and this brings us to the examples that we know better from Canadian history and the history of the West Coast, the increased scrutiny given to Asian immigrants and inhabitants of Chinatowns. International borders and ports of entry increasingly were sites of scrutiny, and indeed one of the earliest laboratories devoted to testing human fluid samples was here at Ellis Island. From the start, arrivals were shown then, as soon as they got off the boat, sometimes even before they got off the boat, that adapting to the public health regimes was an essential part of membership in North American society, okay? Taking shape in remarkable ways in a very short period of time. So this idea of a pandemic public can be thought of not only as people who are forming opinions and responding in various ways to disease, but also as a group or groups of citizens whose bodies can be assessed with respect to the presence or absence of a germ, alongside other social markers like class or gender, ethnicity, and age, and that are also deemed relevant. And as other scholars such as Nyan Shah and Nancy Tomes have argued, the evolving concepts of contagion and control measures deeply influenced concepts of social belonging and hygienic citizenship. And of course, Chinese immigrants were routinely singled out for deemed to have different kinds of public health and sanitary practices than white Canadians and Americans did. So getting near the end here, our modern notion of pandemics reflects our interconnected world. It reflects a conception of infectious disease that is rooted in germs, and the application of this approach to disease also on a global scale. And of course, we experience it on a global scale in ways that were not possible even 10 years ago. So how has this pandemic concept been serving us during COVID-19? And here I've got a graphic of one of the emblems of the COVID pandemic, at least in Canada, the visualization, and we heard this all the time months ago, but we heard it all the time, flattening the curve. I'm sure everyone's heard that at one point or another. And you might be interested to know that this concept of flattening the curve and this graphic Nobody exactly knows where it came from. It was apparently a group effort. Nobody's kind of stepped forward to say, hey, this was my idea. Apparently it was developed by like a group of people kicking ideas around at the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta in the US in 2007. And then the animation here, if you were to go to the internet, you could find an animated version of this, where the lines go up and down depending on what you're doing. It was animated by a physician named Susie Wiles. And this concept of flattening the curve, though, is a very elegant one. It describes the relationship of statistics to behavior. And it further helps to, in Heather McDougall's phrase, to convey uncertainty with clarity. We don't know exactly what we're dealing with, but we can visualize some possible outcomes with this animated notion of flattening the curve. We can envision different scenarios. And that's what flattening the curve is all about, shaping expectations and therefore shaping behavior. It's also distinctively modern because it connects collective well-being to the capacity and integrity of health systems. Health systems. We have to remember that, flattening the curve, it was ultimately about people not getting sick, but it was ultimately about whether or not people taxed the healthcare system. Because what was bad is when the curve was way up, that meant that lots of people were getting sick at the same time. And that was what was bad. It was thought that, people might get sick, but let's just not all get sick together, because that's when really bad things happen. So flattening the curve was an attempt to slow the infection down so that everyone could get the care that they needed. But we can see that this whole idea of flattening the curve rests on assumptions that are rooted in what I've been talking about, this late 19th, early 20th century approach to communicable disease. One of the most important of these assumptions is that we use laboratory data to make these decisions. And this is literally what counts. Case counts. And there's a recognition as well, just as with Typhoid Mary, that people without symptoms, asymptomatic carriers, may still be infected and pass the infection on to others. So this approach to counting also aligns with the quantitative methods that we use to make other decisions, of course. It's not just about pandemics and microbes and so on. It's linked to our communications infrastructure. And that's what makes it, in many important ways, historically and culturally determined. Flattening the curve is something that makes sense to us, but it's not a message or a way of thinking about the pandemic that would make sense to everyone. To a farmer in rural China or India, for example, and there are more of them than there are of us, the idea of flattening the curve would be meaningless. Our thoughts and actions are guided by a distinctive set of concepts, then, that have evolved over time. And they obviously convey certain, or in our experience of them, they create certain benefits. They enable certain kinds of collective action. They help frame things in a certain way. But this streamlined public health message, flatten the curve, and the approach to diseases and microbes that it rests on, also create challenges in what we can maybe call the era of dashboard pandemics or dashboard disasters. We also had firefighting dashboards too. Everybody had a dashboard for something, in the summer of 2020. But questions arise from our use of these dashboards and these statistics with their interchangeable global data. Some of these questions are, how do we take account of diversity among populations in ways that neutrally address variation instead of reflecting or constructing racial or socioeconomic differences? How do we avoid creating stereotypes and having our notions of germs ultimately rest on other social assumptions we have? How do we take into account the diversity of individual experiences within communities among what are deemed to be cases of COVID-19? We all know that a case of COVID-19 is a positive test, but that positive test conceals vast differences in experience and short and long-term impacts and so forth. Confirmation that one has the virus doesn't really tell you very much about a person's experience. And finally, what measures will contribute then to a constructive, inclusive public health response? Our modern notion of pandemics presupposes that germs spread in similar ways around the world. And so this would suggest that if vaccines are distributed globally, it would be both equitable and enlightened self-interest, certainly beneficial for wealthier nations to step up and to make sure that this continues to happen and accelerates. And so to conclude, communication tools and concepts of pandemics, how we think about disease and what the disease is, these concepts are interrelated. And lay people, including people like me, we only have the pandemic that communications infrastructure enables us to have. We can only have the pandemic that we can think because of our forms of communication. And pandemic publics are created then both by theories of disease and by communications technology. And finally, germ theory-based approaches to disease, they also have to account for human diversity and human interactions with environments, the particularity of our bodies and our communities. And this was actually something that if we go back to the beginning of my talk, this was a task that was explored more deeply by disease concepts before circa 1860 or 1870 than it was afterward. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Yes, and I have no idea. I have no idea how long we have for questions, and I do apologize if I went over time. But very, very happy to take questions, and I'll do, if I just kind of stand up here and take questions, that's how it goes. Sure, of course. Yes, sir.
Would you please comment on the tuberculosis epidemic among the Inuit in, I guess, the mid-20th century, earlier?
Can you repeat the question for people?
Yes, and so the question was asking me to comment on the epidemic, real and perceived epidemics of tuberculosis in the mid-20th century among the Inuit. Yes, I actually have a graduate student who was doing research on this, and yes, it's absolutely true that the recognition of that was a function of a couple of different things. One was deepening, didn't mean to do that. Thickening webs of communication and commerce between the far north and the south. So there were actual more incursions of disease into a population that responded very differently than other populations around the world do. But then also correspondent with that, there was observation of that, and a notion that, oh well, here we have Inuit folk who are somewhat susceptible to this, and so yes, that was one of the. Now, there's a lot of different aspects to it, but one aspect of it, that this was one of Canada's sort of early explorations of governance in the far north, and that was one of the things that was propelling, Canadian governance is using public health as a way forward. Certainly, there were substantial cases of spinal tuberculosis and other kinds of tuberculosis. Efforts sometimes helpful, sometimes experimental, to try and deal with that. Was there a particular aspect of that interested you in particular?
I worked up north one summer. A phenomenon I experienced through talking to people, and also when I went into teaching, I was tested for TB, and I had been exposed, so then I had to get a test. So that was part of life. When you became a teacher in the 60s.
Yes, and all sorts, just to pick up on your comment, all sorts of folks have been exposed to TB and it manifests that in their tests. Probably, over half of us, have TB, in that sense of it rattling around in our bodies in one form or another. But that then raises the question, well then if we all have been exposed to it, why do some people get sick and others don't? And this then carries us in some respects back into very deep histories over thousands of years, having to do with some rather fraught questions of differential immunities that have emerged over tens of thousands of years in some cases. But then also, I think more pertinent is questions of what increasingly are referred to as the social determinants of health. What are the aspects of our communities that enable us either to resist or to be more susceptible to disease? And it is shown time and again that the communities and TB is a perfect example, that the communities that are most susceptible are also the communities that are the most deprived, and that systematic deprivation, then disease follows in its train, and so that is certainly that's an experience that's not just limited to the far north. It's also vulnerable indigenous communities elsewhere in Canada, and I'll just give a quick shout out to a colleague, Mary Ellen Kelm, Kelm, who has written about this, about tuberculosis and other diseases, and has some very interesting things to say. Yes, sir.
Yeah, curious to know about Coach's treatment of, not treatment of syphilis, but prevention of syphilis using atoxyl. I'm just casting around trying to figure out what the chemical basis for that might have been. I mean, would it have been as easy as bonking the sufferer of syphilis over the head and then preventing them from going out in society? What was it behind the atoxyl that was thought to be?
Yes, and so Coach conducted experiments with sleeping sickness. I mentioned atoxyl, so this arsenical compound, and it was believed by another researcher, a younger researcher in his orbit named Paul Ehrlich, who was at work in both Berlin and Frankfurt, that there were lessons to be learned about this for the targeting of microbes with certain kinds of toxic compounds. And so he used another similar arsenical compound, arsphenamine, so it's just a different formula, different variant. But the idea, and it was in connection with syphilis, that Ehrlich famously coined the phrase magic bullet. We have a magic bullet in the sense that we are able to target at a microbial level. We can zap and it's with syphilis it's treponema, so it's a treponemal infection. It's a different kind of bacteria. We can zap these little spirochetes, right? Stop them dead in their tracks without doing a whole lot of damage to the rest of the person. And so that's what Ehrlich and his Institute for Infectious Diseases in Frankfurt was doing, borrowing from Coach with arsphenamine, and this was marketed with great fanfare by 1910. And for several decades, different kinds of arsenical compounds were used, in many people's eyes, with some success, alongside topical remedies. I can still find references to using mercury, so mercury compounds, like not raw mercury, but mercuric sulfide, or sulfate, and then smearing that on your privates in order to essentially burn off lesions. So that'll teach you. That's one senses a moralizing undertone to this as well. Yeah. So, but anyway, perhaps that gives you something to chew on there. Yeah. Always a danger with these topics. You never know what you're going to get. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Is there a segue here then with the development of legitimate pharmaceutical research and development? Because this sounds like kind of pulling something out of a hat and giving it a try.
Yeah. I'm sure there's a segue, but I'm not sure I'll find it. The question was, if I understand correctly, what is the connection between this and pharmacological research? There's a whole bunch of trial and error in pharmacological research. Clinical trial, you may as well just add in parentheses "and error" behind it. And someone who's a scientific researcher may disagree with that with me, but certainly in the era that I'm talking about, tremendous amount of overlap. Just to mention one connection that might be interesting for you, the single biggest stimulus to the pharmaceutical industry, I'd say probably in all time, was the petroleum industry. Because what happened with the petroleum, and then also earlier than that, coal. Because what happened was when you burned coal in all of these early 19th century refineries, Manchester and London and what have you, you ended up with a byproduct that people couldn't figure out how to use called coal tar. And it turned out that coal tar is an incredibly rich compound. It's just this slurry of 100 different chemicals. And so people basically tried to pull apart coal tar to figure out what it could do. And so that was one of the key origin points of modern pharmaceuticals. Another key pharmaceutical was the dye industry. And this takes us once again back to Paul Ehrlich. And you think about what a dye does. What does a dye do? A really good dye, it sticks, right? It kind of weaves its way, it burrows its way at the deepest possible level into fabric. It creates a kind of layer, right? Well, that's what people wanted to do with cells in order to block microbes from coming in. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but Ehrlich developed a very important theory known as the side chain theory of basically how different kinds of cells behave and how different kinds of chemical compounds behave. And so they experimented with dyes, first of all to look at microbes, but then ultimately to use dyes to treat, because the dyes that coated could also coat cells. And so trypan red, which was a color, trypan red was used as a way of counteracting trypanosomes. Trypanosomes is a kind of microbe that causes sleeping sickness. So that was one of their other experiments, was using dyes. So basically, the Industrial Revolution also gave rise in important respects to the pharmaceutical revolution. And so Koch was part and parcel of just an enormous kind of fire hose of different scientific innovations. And of course, at the same time, they're looking at this stuff with microscopes because they figured out how to grind their lenses correctly, you know, and look at things in ways that they hadn't before. So, and Koch was able, along with others, was able to put things together in a uniquely persuasive and powerful way, and then people emulated him. Are we about done, or?
We're about done. Let me say a few words before we thank Nick. So I'll give you a chance to thank Mitch in a second again. I just want to say a few other thank yous. So we thank the staff already. I forgot to mention Phil has been doing bartender duty. There he is in the back there, Phil. I mentioned Tom, the two Ashleys, and Shanna, and our volunteers Joyce and Ann and Dave. So thank you all very much. And back at my university, Consuela Kovrig is the person who sends you emails and keeps in touch with you. So thank you, Consuela, if you're watching from home. Hello, Consuela. Just to let you know that Café Historique is back to its traditional day, which is the first Tuesday of every month, and that means that we'll be meeting again on December 7th, I think is the first Tuesday of December, the way December works. And our speaker there will be Jason Colby, who will be speaking on a day that changed the world. The 10th of February, 1957, humans in the warming world is the topic of his talk. So you can see that we've taken two of the big themes of 2021 and wrapped them into Herman's 10 days this year. So I don't know about you, but I learned a lot about the world of disease and a lot of epidemics and the things that I guess I just took for normal and granted about how we are thinking about COVID. Now I know that they aren't normal, and they're all like social constructions that have come through a long period of progression and change. Please join me in thanking Dr. Mitchell Hammond. My friend and colleague Dave Lang is at the door on your way out. If you haven't had a chance to make a donation, he'll be there to gladly receive it. And if you have, thank you so much for that donation. We'll see you again, we hope. We'll post the Eventbrite tickets in the next couple of days for the next talk. And I'm glad to announce that because COVID restrictions are slowly lifting, we're going to be able to have another 25 or so people in the room for our next meeting. So I hope to see you then. Thank you very much for coming tonight.